Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tony Monaco, president of Tufts University. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this year's award ceremony and lectures for the Leontief Prize. I can't think of anything more timely than this prize, given what my news feed is telling me coming out of Washington as we speak. This is the 16th year that GDAE, the Global Development and Environment Institute of Tufts University, has presented the Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. The prize has a distinguished history from its first recipients, Nobel laureate Amartya Sen and John Kenneth Galbraith, to Dr. James Boyce and Dr. Joan Martinez-Alier, whom we honor today. Before I talk about today's ceremony, I want to say a few words about what this award means to Tufts. It aims to recognize, and I quote, outstanding contributions to economic theory that addresses contemporary realities and support just and sustainable societies. The Leontief Prize therefore stands for one of our hallmark values as an institution, leveraging our intellectual and academic strengths to confront the greatest challenges facing the world. It is this spirit of impact-oriented scholarship and teaching that frames Tufts' mission. We believe that this commitment to bridging the gap between theory and practice benefits future generations and contributes to the significance of our work as a university. For over 20 years, GDAE has been at the forefront of essential interdisciplinary scholarship and teaching at Tufts. Its programs have married international development with environmental sustainability, and they have pioneered research and policy recommendations to meet the challenges of the 21st century. GDAE has been integral to Tufts' development as an institution that is intimately involved with greeting such challenges head on. And it truly represents the interdisciplinary spirit of Tufts. GDAE works across schools and departments and involves both graduate and undergraduate students. From the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy to our Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning program and others in the arts and sciences, GDAE and its projects marshal all of the strengths of Tufts to do work that reflects our highest institutional values. Today, we recognize two outstanding scholars of development economics who represent the best of the tradition that GDAE champions and embodies. The 2017 Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought is presented today in the spirit of the theme, Economics, Equity, and the Environment. We live in challenging times, economically and globally and politically. But it is exactly during times like these that the economic interest of development must be informed by concerns, environmental sustainability, and equity. It is exactly this sensibility that we celebrate today in the lives and careers of our Leontief Prize recipients, recognizing Dr. Boyce and Dr. Martinez-Alier for their groundbreaking theoretical and applied work that has effectively integrated ecological, developmental, and justice-oriented approaches into the field of economics. So congratulations to Dr. Boyce and Dr. Martinez-Alier. I am very much looking forward to hearing your lectures, and I am proud to be part of this ceremony, and it's a privilege to welcome you to the Hill. I would like to thank everyone who has made this event and the Leontief Prize possible, including the Fletcher School International Development Group and the Tufts Institute of the Environment, and to extend a warm welcome to everyone for coming out to be part of this exciting event. It is always wonderful to celebrate the great work being done at Tufts and the scholars and practitioners around the world who inspire it. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, President Monaco. That was a really nice introduction and covered a certain amount of what I was going to say, which I have quickly been able to scratch out. But continuing about the theme of economics, equity, and the environment, these three concepts have often been perceived to be in conflict. It's sometimes argued that economic development requires a significant degree of inequality, as well as imposing inevitable environmental costs. But in recent decades, this apparent conflict has become a serious global crisis. We're continually confronted with new evidence of unacceptable levels of inequality and of growing and potentially catastrophic environmental damage. Reconciling economic development with equity, environmental sustainability, and environmental restoration is the urgent task that confronts all nations, both developed and developing. Our speakers today have both been in the forefront of developing a new understanding of economics that will enable both human development and environmental justice. I will start by introducing Professor Joan Martinez-Alier, who will speak first, and later I'll say a little more about the work of Professor James Boyce. Joan Martinez-Alier is Professor of Economics and Economic History at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. He's the author of Ecological Economics, Energy, Environment, and Society, and the Environmentalism of the Poor, a study of ecological conflicts and valuation. He's a founding member and a past president of the International Society for Ecological Economics, and has been a member of the Scientific Committee of the European Environment Agency. He's co-editor of Getting Down to Earth, Practical Applications of Ecological Economics, Recent Developments in Ecological Economics, and of the series Ecological Economics and Human Well-Being. And these are only a few of the dozens of publications of which he's author, co-author, or editor. As the titles of his works suggest, he's been a leader in developing the field of ecological economics, which presents a broader perspective than standard environmental economics. It emphasizes the integrity of ecological systems, as well as the importance of social and ethical issues. Professor Martinez-Alier's work strongly supports the proposition that it's impossible to have true economic development without addressing issues of ecological distribution, the needs of the poor, and those of indigenous and peasant groups, who are often exploited and robbed of the natural resources on which they depend for their livelihoods and their survival. The inspiration of Professor Martinez-Alier's work has led to an extensive and growing body of research, writing, and activism promoting socially and ecologically sound development. We are honored today to recognize him as a recipient of the 2017 Leontief Prize.
Thank you very much for this prize. I think I've been here in Tufts at least once or twice, and so I know what you are doing here for a very long time in this Institute on Development and the Environment. So it's a long relation, but I didn't expect this prize. I'm very pleased about this prize because also the people who got it before myself, and also because I know Jim Boyce for quite a few decades already. So, and we are friends. And what I'm going to talk about is not about the past, what I have done before, is about what I'm going to do in the next few years if everything goes all right and my hard disk has no damages. And because I got a big grant last year from the European Union, which I don't know why they still are dishing money around, and is about this. This is what perhaps is the concept that I have helped to introduce in ecological economics and environmental studies and political ecology. And the project now is about this, what I want to do, to work more on ecological distribution conflicts, which are not economic distribution conflicts because they cannot be translated into a single unit of value, into utility or money. They are expressed in different social values. which are not commensurable, or they're only commensurable with money values if one does violence to people by political means, or by instruments like cost-benefit analysis. But people are quite often reluctant to submit themselves to an economic or crematistic logic. This is why some 20 years ago already, we started to write about these ecological distribution conflicts, saying these are not economic distribution conflicts, cannot be reduced to them. And this is an atlas we're doing already for 4 or 5 years of ecological distribution conflicts around the world. So you can go into this atlas, and these are coded by whether yellow means nuclear conflicts and blue means water conflicts and so on. A lot of mineral mining conflicts and fossil fuel conflicts, fossil fuels and climate justice conflicts. So this is what I have been doing with a team in the last 4 or 5 years. So if you don't know what ecological conflicts are, you go to one of these and you will find so many examples. We have over 2,000 now, and some areas in the world are not well covered yet, but they are going to be. And there are conflicts at the commodity extraction frontiers and also on waste disposal. And let's assume that the economy would not grow anymore, as some people say, like Tim Jackson in Britain, or people I know very well in France or Spain from the décroissance school. Let's assume that the economy does not grow. Even then, an industrial economy would have to go to the commodity extraction frontiers to get fresh oil, coal, gas, because the economy is not circular, the economy is entropic. This means that energy, as you all know or should know, or you have studied in early times in the school, energy cannot be recycled, isn't it? Therefore, the industrial economy is based on the fossil fuels, so it's sun energy from many millions of years ago, and we are using it, and we have to go back to find new supplies. And the same for materials. There are accounts, recent accounts published in the Journal of Industrial Ecology showing that in the year 2005, only 6% of all the materials going to the economy were recycled at the end. Mainly some metals like copper or aluminum can be recycled more. So the economy is, as Georgescu, Reagan said, and the founders in the previous generation of ecological economics said, the economy is entropic, and this is what it means. It's not circular, it is entropic. And this explains that there are so many resource extraction conflicts and also waste disposal conflicts, of which perhaps the main one, at least in volume, is the increasing greenhouse effect. And from this institutional and ecological economics, one can say that externalities are not just small anecdotal events in the economy, which can be easily internalized into the price system. Externalities are part of the system, of the industrial system. I was going to say the capitalist industrial system, but there is only one industrial system in the world, because we don't know exactly the nature of the system in China, how to describe it. But anyway, it's just the same system of using fossil fuels and a growing economy. So externalities are not so much market failures. I wrote here as cost-shifting successes, which was something that was almost said by Carl Wilhelm Kapp already in 1950. He didn't use the word success, which I use ironically because, of course, I don't like these successes. But it's not always successful because sometimes people complain. That's why there is a movement around the world calling itself climate justice, for instance, and another calling itself water justice. People complain and they make networks, social networks, and all this constitutes something which I have called myself and other people the global movement for environmental justice, with a question mark at the end, because I don't know whether it really exists or not. In any case, it's a movement which is rather like the feminist movement perhaps has no Politburo or central committee. It's not like the international of at the time of Marx and Bakunin and so on, who fought about themselves immediately. It's more like the feminist movement, I think. It's not even like Via Campesina, which is more structured, but there is, I think, this global environmental justice movement. One big externality, so to speak, because I wouldn't call it externality, is climate change. And I was very impressed by the attitude of Todd Stern, not Nicholas Stern, who is a Leontief Prize recipient, isn't it? The economist. Todd Stern, who is was the US ambassador from Copenhagen to Paris, at least, I don't know whether before. And in Paris, he was very pleased, and in Copenhagen, because he said, we have convinced the world of putting into the agreement a clause which is called no liability. So no liability is a very large statement to make. So no liability. We, the rich people in the world, are not liable legally for climate change, or the US government is not liable according to the Paris Agreement. I know there are things worse, so to speak, than the Paris Agreement. And you refer to Washington, the president here, a few minutes ago. So what the policy of the US is now, one could say, is even worse. But I don't agree with this no liability statement. And I was impressed because the Pope, which I don't know the Pope in person, but I know people who know the Pope, and because he's from Argentina and he's a familiar kind of figure, well, in the encyclical, he himself or whoever advised him took some paragraphs, which 51 and 52, saying there is liability, there is ecological debt from the north to the south, historical and at present. So that's one thing I want to say, that the system is a system of no recognition of liability. So all the talk about externalities is just distraction. In these others and in this project, this is what we're doing. We are collecting these cases, and we have a new project, as I said before, and this project is going, for instance, when we look at the statistics of these 2,000 cases we have in the others, we see that in about 18% of the cases, more or less, environmental justice is said to be achieved. For instance, projects are stopped. For instance, the Dakota pipeline, this is not going to be put as a success, I think, because I think they have been dismissed from the... and then in many of them, like 14% or 15%, people get killed in one of these. Of course, there's many more in Brazil than in New England, isn't it? But this is a distribution of, so it's a serious kind of events, these conflicts quite often. And here I want to show only 4 cases. This is one from the north of Chennai. I've been there. I wrote myself the case in the others. I don't want to go into the case just in case something happens here with internet. But I was planning to put this song. You can go to YouTube and listen to the song in Tamil by T.M. Krishna saying, defending the word Poramboke in Tamil, saying this is a commons which is being now destroyed by some coal power stations and chemical industry in a creek to the north of the city of Madras, Chennai. And it's a very beautiful song. Perhaps if we have 5 minutes at the end, we can try to put the song. Because he's reclaiming the word Poramboke, saying Poramboke means the commons. And now in Tamil, say Poramboke, they think means vacant land, that anybody can throw all the refuse there. I don't know whether there is any Tamil-speaking person in the audience. And he could make a contribution to this. So I think this also shows that in many of these conflicts, some cultural productions arise, songs or poetry. The easiest poetry, this is slogan saying, leave oil in the soil and leave coal in the hole, isn't it? Invented by Nemo Bassi from Nigeria in a meeting like this. He said, We have to do this already 20 years ago. They were saying this in Nigeria and in Ecuador. The second case will be known to some of you, or many of you. Berta Cáceres is dead just 1 year ago in Honduras against a hydroelectric dam, and is one of the many men and women killed around the world in this kind of conflicts. Here, indigenous territorial rights is the main argument, and also the sacredness of the river. So how do you translate indigenous rights and sacredness into money? It doesn't fit very well. So the economists here are out of business. We could say it's not the logic of the local people. You could force them to take a course in macroeconomics and cost and PIGU and so on. But yeah, why should they do this? I mean, they have other things to do. And this is another woman in Philippines, as you know, they still keep Spanish names sometimes. And she opposed the construction of a coal stockpile facilities in displaced Mariveles and also a coal-fired power station. And at the same time, and this is something interesting, she was member of this Philippine movement for climate justice, a name that they put themselves probably 10 or 15 years ago, or perhaps 2000, because from the year 2000, there is this way that some indebted countries had a financial debt, but the North owe them in theory, because no liability, but in theory, they owe them an ecological debt. And Katarungan means, I understand, justice. So and it also says coal kills. Well, you cannot prove things with pictures like this, isn't it? But the fact that behind this thing, we have like 6 pages in the atlas of information about each of these particular cases. So lots of master theses can be done with the atlas, or even some doctoral theses based on territories, on geographic or transversal. There are here in the audience at least 1 or 2 people who have helped doing cases for the atlas. You could do, for instance, uranium mining across the world, or you could do the environment, the political ecology of Bulgaria, for instance. And this is the 4th case I want to show, because I think it's very interesting what is happening in Japan, in which they have 50 nuclear power stations are stopped after Fukushima because people don't want them to start again. And this is one of the cases in Fukui prefecture, in which these lawyers are saying, as people tell me, because I hope the translation is all right, that they are happy because the courts gave them an injunction, or agreed to an injunction on starting 1 or 2 nuclear power plants again in this place called Ui. So I could go on up to 2042, I think we have today, which I'm not going to do. I chose to do this because they are a bit around the world, isn't it? About places I would like to know much more than I do, like Philippines or Japan. We have also people from China working on this now, which is a bit difficult. And this is what we're going to do. And so to go to the end, this project will expand the atlas, will also compile a global vocabulary of environmental justice, vocabulary in words, but also in images and banners and songs and so on. And also would try to show how there is a link between the European décroissance or post-vacuum or prosperity without growth movement, which is the same thing, but with different names, meaning we have grown enough. Young people, many young, or some young people go to the meetings. One of the penultimate one was in Leipzig, and there were like 4,000 people in this post-growth or degrowth meeting, and how this links with environmental justice, because one of the reasons not to grow anymore is because, as I explained in the beginning, growing means going to the borders, to the frontiers of extraction, and they're collecting things and sort of going into the porambokes, the commons around the world still, or producing waste, which is also going to what should be a well-managed commons, which is the atmosphere or the oceans. And the questions are, as these two questions, which are genuine questions, because I don't know whether all this is like this, whether there is a global movement for environmental justice, which is a force for sustainability, and which are the links between the metabolism, meaning the use of energy and materials, this is called the social metabolism, to ecological distribution conflicts, to movements for environmental justice, and then to sustainability. So sustainability from the grassroots, I could say, is not from public policies, is more from the actions of people complaining. There's no time to explain all this, and you cannot see it from behind, but at least you can see the main four titles. So from the metabolism, we can go to study the ecological distribution conflicts or socio-environmental conflicts. And from here, we can see how these movements are developing, and hopefully these movements are helping to have a transition to sustainability. And if, of course, we have a transition to sustainability, then the social metabolism would be different, and this circle would be different. It's not, for instance, if we have more windmills, as is happening in the world, well, this produces another types of conflict, sometimes purely aesthetic, that people don't like the windmills in Toscana, for instance. And sometimes people don't like windmills because windmills, I haven't seen anybody claiming right to the wind. I mean, peasants they have never thought that the wind would belong to them, isn't it? It's the companies that said, we have right to the wind. But they think that they have right to the land. The peasants have right to the land. So they object to the windmills because of the land use. And this happens in Mexico, in Mexico, Oaxaca, for instance, and around the world in other places. So the details of this would be different. And hopefully, this works in a way that we become a less unsustainable economy. And this, assuming that this is going to be put somewhere in internet, I put some self-advertisement at the end, which, and also this is good for the students, if they have something, they want to read some articles. So these are some of the latest articles. There are only 2 pages, this and this one. And the ones with a star are the main ones related to what I'm talking about, and to the prize. I suppose the prize has to do with what I have done more than what I'm going to do, because you don't know what I'm going to do. But I think there is a continuity from what I have done and what I am going to do. I am not finished yet, so there will be more publications and more cases in the atlas, but these with the star are the sort of the main publications on this project up to now. Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah.
So there is a plaque that we will actually send home for Joan so that he doesn't have to carry it in his luggage. And hope you will remember our great gratitude to you for the work you're doing and for this excellent talk. Thank you very much. I will now introduce Dr. James Boyce, who has devoted his career to forging an economics that not only fundamentally incorporates environmentally sustainable policies, but also recognizes social justice and equity. His concerns for economic justice go back to the 1970s, when he lived in India and Bangladesh, working on issues of poverty and hunger. His early work as an academic continued this focus on economic development, expanding into such topics as the odious indebtedness of many developing countries, economic policies to promote peace and post-conflict recovery, and the need for agricultural innovation in rural areas. For about the last 20 years, Jim's primary research focus has been on environmental issues. As he will elaborate today, he has written extensively on the relationship between economic inequality and the environment. He's also studied the relationship between jobs and the environment, finding little evidence of a trade-off between the two. He has argued for the democratization of natural assets, starting from the premise that resources such as land, water, and the atmosphere belong to all of us equally, regardless of income or political power. Based on such principles, he has detailed climate policies that not only meet environmental goals, but are firmly rooted in economic justice. Rather than being discouraged by the current political divisiveness in Washington, D.C., he wrote earlier this year that a climate policy based on carbon dividends, which he will discuss today, should appeal to both conservatives and liberals. Jim's academic accomplishments are many and diverse. At the University of Massachusetts Amherst, he's a professor in the economics department and also the director of the Program on Development, Peacekeeping, and the Environment within the Political Economy Research Institute. Among his many books are The Political Economy of the Environment, Reclaiming Nature, Ecological Restoration, and Environmental Justice, and most recently, Economics, the Environment, and Our Common Wealth. He also serves as president of the organization Econ 4, that's a number 4, which promotes economics for the people, for the planet, and for the future. We at GDAE have long admired Jim's work and frequently incorporated the results of his research into our textbooks. Looking forward, our respect for him is most recently evident in that we've just hired one of his PhD students, Pratista Joshi-Karnekar, as a GDAE colleague. Looking back, the awarding of the Leontief Prize to Jim Boyce reflects the 17-year history of this award, since Jim studied at Oxford University as a student of our very first Leontief recipient, Amartya Sen. We are delighted to recognize Jim's work today and award him the 2017 Leontief Prize.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here today and an honor to receive this award. And I'm especially pleased to be doing so along with Joan Martinez-Alier, who, in addition to being an inspiring economist, is also an old friend. In fact, his daughter was my daughter's first babysitter in Oxford about 30 years ago. In announcing the Leontief Prize, GDAE referred to my work on inequality in the environment. So I thought it would be appropriate to share with you how I came to work in this area and to highlight a few of the things I've learned. I began my career in the field of development, specifically agriculture, which is another thing Joan and I share in common. In the middle of my undergraduate studies, I worked for 2 years in the Indian state of Bihar on a Gandhian land reform project. And a few years later, my partner Betsy Hartman and I lived in a Bangladesh village with the aim of writing a book to address some of the basic questions that Westerners have about what used to be called the Third World. Questions like, what are the causes of poverty and hunger? What is the position of women? What's the role of religion? What's the impact of foreign aid? And in our book, A Quiet Violence, we explored these issues through the stories of real people as much as possible in their own words. These were formative experiences for me, living among some of the world's poorest people and coming to see life through their eyes profoundly shaped my views of the world and its problems. One important lesson was about the debilitating effects of the unequal distribution of wealth and power. The fact that hundreds of millions of people went hungry then and still today is not because there's not enough food in the world, but because they lack the purchasing power to buy it in the market and the political power to obtain it by other means. The peasant farmers and agricultural laborers of Bangladesh and Bihar understood these realities clearly, even though they came as news to many economists a few years later when Amartya Sen laid them out in his book, Poverty and Famines. In South Asia, I also began to understand that inequality not only determines who eats and who starves, with results that can be tragic and obscene, but also constrains productivity, resulting in a smaller economic pie than what would be possible in a more egalitarian and productive society, an effect that can be termed the inefficiency of inequality. When I entered graduate school at Oxford, a decade after having first set foot in Bihar, this is what I wanted to explore. At Oxford, I was fortunate to study with two brilliant economists, Keith Griffin and Amartya Sen, and with their guidance, I returned to South Asia to carry out research for my dissertation, which analyzed how agrarian equality impeded the development of irrigation and water to the detriment of rice production. That became my book, Agrarian Impasse in Bengal. I mention this background because our relationship to the environment as a source of raw materials and as a sink for the disposal of wastes is similar in important ways to the relationship of South Asian villagers to the land. In both cases, the distribution of wealth and power determines who gets what and shapes how we use or abuse nature's wealth. After completing my doctorate, I accepted a job in the University of Massachusetts Amherst Economics Department, which then and now was an oasis for free thought, in a profession that all too often seems to believe in a free market in everything except ideas. The intellectual blinders on economics were particularly tight at that time in the era of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. At UMass, I started a course called The Political Economy of the Environment, in which my students and I, one of my students, Rachel, is actually here now, explored interactions between inequality and the environment. In the early 1990s, I received a Fulbright fellowship to go to Costa Rica to help establish a master's program in ecological economics and sustainable development at the National University. While I was there, I was invited to speak at a conference. It was my first public presentation in Spanish on political economy and the environment. The English version of that talk appeared in the journal Ecological Economics in 1994. It was titled Inequality as a Cause of Environmental Degradation. This was an effort to theorize how the inequalities of power and wealth that structure our relationships with each other also structure our relationships with nature. I began by noting that whenever we encounter environmental degradation, we can pose three basic questions. First, who benefits from the activities that degrade the environment? If nobody wins, or at least thinks they'll win, the activities wouldn't occur. Second, who bears the costs? If no one were harmed by these activities, they wouldn't be a problem, at least from the standpoint of human welfare. Third, why is it that the winners are able to impose these costs on others? I suggested three possible answers to the last question. One is that the losers do not yet exist. They belong to future generations who are not here to defend themselves. In such cases, I believe the only solution is for the present generation to cultivate an ethic of responsibility towards those who will follow, an ethic that in my mind goes together with gratitude for what we've received from those who came before us. The second possibility is that those who bear environmental costs lack information. They may know that their children are getting sick, but not that the cause of pollution is a nearby factory, that the cause of that illness is pollution from a nearby factory. In such cases, the solution lies in environmental education, including crucially the right to know what's in our environment and who put it there. The third possibility is that those who are harmed are alive today and well aware of what's happening, but that they lack sufficient wealth and power to prevail against those who benefit from environmentally degrading activities. I call this the power-weighted social decision rule. A society's decisions about whether, when, and where to degrade or protect the environment are shaped by the preferences and relative power of those who win and lose from these decisions. The power to influence environmental outcomes operates in both the market and in the state. In the sphere of the market, we call it purchasing power. In the sphere of the state, we call it political power. These two domains of power are correlated. People with more wealth tend to have more political influence, and vice versa. The state-market dichotomy dominated political and economic discourse in the 19th and 20th centuries, demarcating left from right, But in analyzing the political economy of environmental degradation, we can discern perhaps a more fundamental dichotomy between societies with a democratic versus oligarchic distribution of wealth and power. I hypothesized in my 1994 article that wider inequalities of wealth and power generally result in more environmental degradation. At the time, this was a decidedly unpopular view. A referee for a volume to which I was invited to contribute a follow-up paper panned the idea, asserting that Boyce is beating a dead horse, a phrase that for some reason stuck in my mind. He meant, I think, that in the end of history days of the roaring 1990s, no one still thought that inequality was something to get worked up about. It turns out the horse was only on tranquilizers. Now it's wide awake and kicking, and inequality today is all the rage in more senses than one. I and other researchers went on to test the power-weighted social decision rule hypothesis against empirical evidence, analyzing international variations in pollution and other environmental indicators, for example. Mariano Torres and I found that equality, especially when measured by the extent of literacy and political rights and civil liberties, is a strong predictor of environmental degradation, or the environmental protection, the reverse. Similarly, when several colleagues and I analyzed interstate variations in the US, we found that states with more equally distributed power, as proxied by voter participation, educational attainment, and fiscal policy fairness, tend to have stronger environmental policies and better environmental outcomes. Returning to South Asia for a moment, the Indian scholar Bina Agarwal has documented the environmental impacts of equality and inequality along the axis of gender. In India's forest-dependent communities, those where women participate in management committees use forest resources more sustainably than those where women are excluded. Gender equity is not only good for women, it turns out it's good for the environment too. More research remains to be done to understand how inequality affects the environment, but it's no longer outlandish to suggest that it does. Let me now turn to causal linkages in the reverse direction, running from environmental degradation to inequality. A second hypothesis suggested by the power-weighted social decision rule is that environmental costs are not randomly distributed across the population. They're not impartial externalities. Instead, these costs are disproportionately imposed on communities and people with less wealth and less power. This prediction is consistent with the findings of the now extensive literature on environmental justice to which Joan Martinez-Alier has contributed. Beginning in the 1980s, Robert Bullard and other researchers here in the US began to document systematic disparities in exposure to environmental hazards, focusing initially on the disproportionate siting of toxic waste dumps in African American neighborhoods. These findings, coupled with pressure from EJ activists, led to President Clinton's 1994 executive order directing federal agencies to identify and address disproportionately high and adverse human health and environmental impacts on minorities and low-income populations. Since that time, EJ researchers have produced an extensive body of evidence documenting that environmental disparities mirror inequalities in the distribution of wealth and power. A notable finding in this literature is that race and ethnicity, at least in the United States, are highly significant as predictors of environmental harm, even after controlling for the effects of income. This finding casts doubt on the proposition that market dynamics arising from lower housing prices, for example, in more polluted neighborhoods, could suffice to explain our environmental disparities. It attests instead to the enduring connection between race and power in America, political as well as purchasing power. Indeed, there's evidence that environmental qualities in the United States are greater than income inequalities. Exposure to toxic air pollution from industrial sites, for example, is more unequally distributed than income, both vertically from lowest to highest and horizontally between groups defined on the basis of race and ethnicity. In response to these findings, some might ask, so what? By many measures, including life expectancy, income, employment, education, incarceration rates, there are vast inequalities, both vertical and horizontal, in the US. In this landscape of multiple and overlapping disparities, how important is the environmental layer? Put differently, is environmental quality a luxury, something that the affluent and perhaps middle-class people can afford to worry about, but an issue that ranks low on the list of priorities for disadvantaged communities? Apart from its value as an intrinsic human right, a clean and safe environment has important instrumental value too, particularly for children. For example, when Manuel Pastor and his colleagues analyzed school performance in Los Angeles, controlling for usual determinants such as parental income and education, class size, teacher salaries, they discovered that exposure to air toxics has a significant negative effect on standardized test scores. Pollution exposure has been shown to have serious adverse effects on fetal and child health. It also results in lower property values, more days lost from work due to illness and caring for sick kids, and higher healthcare expenditures. Low-income and minority communities across the country have given their own answer to the so what question by mobilizing to fight against the contamination of their air and water. Indeed, polls in the US find that people of color often are more environmentally aware than Anglo-whites. An ABC News Washington Post poll released in November 15, for example, found that 78% of non-whites agreed with the statement that climate change is a serious problem, compared to 56% of whites. A final point I want to make about environmental justice is that it's not a zero-sum game. At first blush, one might imagine that higher pollution burdens for people of color mean a cleaner environment for Anglo-whites. But the total quantity of pollution varies as well as its distribution. It turns out that localities where industrial air pollution is more unequally distributed tend to have higher exposure for everyone, including whites. Perhaps corporations act as if the cost of pollution is lower when it's borne primarily by minorities, so they emit more of it. Perhaps whites put more political capital into influencing zoning and housing policies in regions with higher pollution. Or perhaps, a dispiriting thought, whites care more about their pollution burdens relative to minorities than about its absolute level. Whatever the reasons, this finding implies that environmental justice could be good for white folks too. I was given the opportunity to work more on the policy implications of the links between inequality and the environment starting in the late 1990s when my colleagues Bob Poland and Jerry Epstein, who are here today, at UMass Amherst launched the Political Economy Research Institute, PERI. PERI provided a platform for me to launch a number of collaborative research projects. One of these was the Natural Assets Project. This was the brainchild of Michael Conroy, who at the time was working as a program officer at the Ford Foundation. The project's aim was to explore how environmental protection can be reframed as building assets in the hands of low-income communities and individuals. It gave me the opportunity to bring together a remarkable group of scholars and activists from around the country and around the world, from whom I learned a great deal. And I'll conclude today by giving two examples of natural asset building strategies that we proposed. The first is a strategy for the conservation of biodiversity that underpins long-term food security for humankind, an issue that Joan helped me to become interested in when I met him in Costa Rica in 1993. I don't know if you remember that. I'm referring here to genetic diversity in crops and livestock, the cultivated biodiversity that evolved through what Charles Darwin in the opening chapter of On the Origin of Species called artificial selection. Artificial selection is the evolutionary process guided through the millennia by human hands, by which plants and animals were first domesticated and then diversified into thousands of distinct varieties adapted to environmental and cultural differences across the globe. This diversity provides the foundation for agriculture, modern as well as traditional, to adapt to changing pest and pathogen populations and also in coming years to adapt to climate change. A hallmark of industrial agriculture has been the displacement of these diverse varieties by a handful that have been bred to maximize specific properties, above all the ability to turn fertilizer into grain. The resulting monocultures may be efficient from the perspective of short-run profit maximization, but they achieve this at the long-run peril of putting all our eggs in one basket. To adapt to changing growing conditions over time, agriculture depends on the suite of diverse varieties that's being eroded by modern agriculture itself. This genetic erosion ranks alongside climate change as perhaps the greatest environmental challenge of our time. Regrettably, it does not receive commensurate attention, perhaps in part because many environmentalists, especially in the United States, are wedded to a vision of wild nature that disdains human-altered landscapes and cultivated biodiversity. The loss of crop and livestock diversity remains far from complete, however. Across the world, and especially in the historic centers of origin of crops that, as the great Russian biologist Nikolai Vavilov recognized, are the modern centers of genetic diversity, farmers carry on the long tradition of conservation and ongoing evolution of cultivated biodiversity. These farmers include campesinos growing maize and beans in the hills of south-central Mexico and Guatemala, and potatoes in the Andes, peasants cultivating rice in South and Southeast Asia, and small farmers tilling wheat and barley in the Near East and Central Asia, and millets in Africa. Apart from cultivating diversity, what do these farmers have in common? First, they're poor, often desperately so. Second, far from being appreciated for their vital contribution to the current and future food security of humankind, they're looked down upon. They're scorned as backwards by elites in their own countries and most international development experts too. Third, their livelihoods are often threatened today by cheap imports from industrial agriculture that are often dumped below the market cost of production, let alone their true environmental cost. And finally, as a result, more and more of them, particularly young people, are abandoning the land to seek better lives elsewhere. As they do so, the erosion of cultivated diversity accelerates. It would be a mistake to think that we can fully insure against this loss by simply storing seeds in what are called gene banks. Ex situ off-site collections like the National Laboratory for Genetic Resource Preservation in Fort Collins, Colorado, are tremendously valuable, and it's vital that we fund them and keep them in the public domain. But they're not an adequate substitute for in situ or in the field diversity for three reasons. First, gene banks can never be 100% secure. Accidents happen. So do wars and natural disasters. And biological materials not inert like gold and silver. Seeds must be stored under the right temperature and humidity and periodically replanted, harvested, and stored again. Otherwise, they die. Second, simply having seeds in the bank does not mean we know what we have. The records may show that a packet of seeds was collected in a given time and place, but we don't know whether this variety is resistant to new strains of insects or diseases or climate variations. The farmers who grow them are the repositories of this knowledge, and without them, the seeds lose much of their value. Finally, even if seed banks were perfectly secure, which they aren't, and even if we knew all there is to know about every variety, which we can't, the most they can do is freeze in place the existing stock of genetic diversity. Seed banks do not replicate the ongoing evolution of diversity in the field under the pressure of evolving pests and pathogens and climate changes. The interaction between humans and nature that originally created and now sustains this diversity cannot be stored in a vault. The good news is that we can maintain diversity in the field by rewarding the farmers around the world who cultivate it. This will require a radical shift in agricultural policies. Instead of subsidizing industrial agricultures, we need to reallocate public resources and recognition to small farmers, above all in the centers of diversity. We need to abandon our myopic definition of efficiency and replace it with a more robust standard that embraces resilience and sustainability. Rather than undermining the livelihoods of the women and men who cultivate diversity, we need to reward them. Rather than disparaging them, we should thank them. And by rewarding their contributions to the common good, we can advance jointly the goals of reducing inequality and protecting the environment. Let me turn lastly to the other great environmental challenge of our time, global climate change. In one sense, just about anything we do to mitigate climate change will mitigate inequality too, since it's the poorest people at home and abroad who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate destabilization. This grim reality was illustrated vividly in New Orleans in 2005, when those who lost their lives and their homes to Hurricane Katrina were disproportionately poor and disproportionately Black. Burning fossil fuels releases a toxic slew of pollutants, including sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and fine particulates, along with carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas. For this reason, curbing their use will generate air quality and public health co-benefits, as well as climate benefits. And because they bear the highest pollution burdens, low-income and disadvantaged communities stand to gain the most, especially if climate policies are designed with these co-benefits in mind. The clean energy transition will require very large investments in energy efficiency and renewables. As my Perry colleagues Bob Poland and Heidi Garrett-Peltier have shown, these require considerably more labor per investment dollar than fossil fuel extraction. Retrofitting buildings for energy efficiency, for example, creates many jobs in the building and construction trades. In economies with substantial unemployment and underemployment, these employment gains also make a major contribution to the reduction of inequality. These ways that climate policy can reduce inequality are widely recognized. Here I want to focus on a less familiar opportunity, carbon dividends. This is an idea I first heard about from Peter Barnes, a colleague in the Natural Assets Project. One key element of effective climate policy is putting a price on carbon emissions. This can be done by means of either a carbon tax or a cap and permit system. From an administrative standpoint, it's simplest to charge the price where the fossil carbon enters the economy at the tanker port or coal mine head or natural gas terminal. The tax or permit cost enters into the price of the fuel and is passed on to final users, including you and me. This provides an incentive for all of us, households, businesses, governments, to consume less carbon and invest in energy efficiency and renewables. But a drawback of carbon pricing, and indeed of any policy that increases fuel prices, is that it's distributionally regressive. Richer households, at least in industrialized countries, typically have bigger carbon footprints than low-income and middle-class households for the simple reason that they consume more of just about everything. In absolute dollar amounts, they would pay more as a result of carbon price. But as a percentage of income in the US and similar countries, poor households would pay more than the rich, reflecting the fact that fuels are a necessity, not a luxury. On its own, therefore, carbon pricing would exacerbate economic inequality rather than reducing it. But the extra money that consumers pay as a result of carbon pricing does not evaporate. It's not shot to the moon or buried in a backyard. It's not sent to Saudi Arabia or other oil producers. Instead, this money is available for recycling within the economy of the state or nation that charges the carbon price. One way to recycle part or all of the money is through dividends paid equally to every woman, man, and child. This has been proposed in the US by Senators Maria Cantwell and Susan Collins, and by then Congressman, now Senator Chris Van Hollen. Their bills would set a cap on carbon emissions that tightens over time, issue permits up to this limit, auction all the permits, and return all or most of the revenue to the people as equal dividends. Carbon dividends are an example of a broader class of policies that would provide universal basic income from assets that we own in common. For example, the state of Alaska pays equal dividends annually to all its residents from its oil revenues. Since carbon dividends would be paid equally to all, regardless of how much fossil fuel they personally use, everyone would still have a strong incentive to reduce their consumption of fossil fuels. Recycling the carbon revenues as dividends turns the regressive impact of carbon pricing alone into a progressive impact. Most low-income households would come out ahead in pocketbook terms, since the dividends they receive would exceed their increased fuel costs. Middle-class households generally would break even, with dividends protecting their real incomes. Most rich households would pay more than they get back in dividends, but they can afford it, and they and their children would share in the benefits of climate stabilization and clean air. Much as rewarding small farmers for sustaining crop genetic diversity would combat inequality and protect our environment at the same time, so would price and dividend carbon policies. As these examples illustrate, fighting inequality and environmental degradation are not only complementary in theory, they can be combined and pursued together in practice. This is where I believe environmentalism is headed in the 21st century. We will not safeguard the environment without addressing the inequalities of wealth and power that perpetuate pollution and natural resource depletion. And we will not achieve a more equitable society without protecting the environment in which we live and work and play. If my work helps others to recognize these connections and act upon them, I'll feel I've done something to deserve this prize. Thank you very much.
Jim, thank you very much. This was a wonderful summary of so much important information. And here is the proof of it to take home.
All right, thanks very much.
Bill Mumma, who is the co-director with me of GDAE, is going to take questions.
Good. Well, that was splendid. And besides informing us in a wonderful way and enlightening us, I'm sure that there are many questions that people might have. So raise your hand and I will recognize you and you can direct your question to either of the speakers. I can't believe you were so clear that nobody has a question. I mean, it's wonderfully done, but still. Neva, why don't you go first?
I'll start off with a question for Jim. Why does gender equity promote environmental protection? Is it just for women?
Should I go up there to answer?
Yeah.
So the question for anyone who didn't hear was, why does gender equity promote environmental protection? Is it just because women are nicer? Well, frankly, I wouldn't rule that out as part of the explanation. But I think it varies from circumstances from one setting to the next. But in the work of Bina Agarwal, to which I referred, which is a very clear and important case where that is true, what is evident is that women are among the most important users of natural resources. So, for example, collecting fuel from forests for cooking. And by virtue of that role, they know a lot about those resources and care a lot about their conservation and sustainable use. When they are excluded from the committees that are constructed to manage the forests under government-backed village-level management initiatives, the result is that some of the people who know most about the problem aren't participating in decisions about how to manage the resource. On top of that, some of the men are perhaps more interested in turning the forest into cash in their pockets than maintaining them for the well-being of their families down the road. So that's an example of how this plays out. And I would invite people to try to think of other examples. I think this is an area on which a lot of interesting work could be done. Much of the inequality environment analysis has been along axes of income, race, and ethnicity. But since power is distributed differentially across gender lines as well as across those other lines, one might expect that similar kinds of dynamics could be observed.
Thank you. Yes, please.
So you were talking about giving benefits to poor farmers who are protecting biodiversity. And I think one of the issues with that is that it requires people who have the power to somehow, convince themselves to give money to those farmers. But I know there's a growing movement in this country of food sovereignty among Native American farmers who are protecting biodiversity and also reclaiming cultural assets and things like that. So I wonder if there's the potential in that for transforming into sort of a local living economy approach where where communities can be building those assets internally to promote biodiversity.
Well, I think the so-called new agriculture movement in the industrialized countries has a real complementarity with the movements of peasants and indigenous people around the world to which Joan referred, which he knows more about than I do, really. I think there are a variety of ways in which we can support each other in this, and people here can support peasants and small farmers in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, who are in the real centers of crop genetic diversity. By rewarding them, I don't only refer to money, but I refer, for example, to the struggles that are going on all the time over the allocation of land, over public policies that affect that allocation. Struggles that, for example, in Colombia, in the wake of the peace accord, are now going to be very, very clear and very sharp. It can include rewarding communities, providing public goods, schools, hospitals, so that people don't have to leave the village in order to ensure that their kids can be born more safely or get an education. But it can also include paying a higher price for what peasants produce and removing the absurd subsidies that we currently pay for industrial agriculture, which is creating social environmental costs as opposed to benefits.
Yes.
My question is for Joan. And I'm curious about, especially with a danger that seems to be increasing in relation to environmental activists around the world, like Berta in Honduras, for example, and others, and then juxtaposed with what happened recently in Colombia and the events that are quite positive there. I'm curious how this global environmental justice movement, through the Atlas and through the work that you're doing, might either support or hinder activism in those ways. And I say hinder because of the danger involved with that kind of activism, but support in knowing that social movements need a kind of leavening effect in order to really take notice.
Yeah, well, I think that that in this Atlas, what we do is to give visibility to things which could have been already visible because we use secondary sources and we don't discover any sort of secret movements that the police wouldn't know about it anywhere in the world. So what we do is to show that these ecological distribution conflicts sometimes they network with one another, the activists involved, and therefore that we can show that there is perhaps this environmental movement, global environmental movement, which in fact the word environmental justice was born in this country, as Jim explained, in the early 80s by people like Bob Bullard and other people who saw that there was this disproportionate impact of pollutants in areas of what you call in this country people of color, which I always find a bit funny because we all have some color. I am probably a bit pink, isn't it? And pink and green I should be. But anyway, I know the reasons for this and the history of racism in this country and many other places in the world. So this was the environmental justice movement. So what we are doing is to discover, and even in 91, there was a meeting in Washington, which was called the first meeting of environmental leaders of people of color in the US, which was a very important meeting, I think, because they established like 17 principles, I think, of environmental justice. And it was not parochial, it was really worldwide. And they were also talking about whales and other species and looking at indigenous people in the States, but also outside the States. So this is something that is the origin of this intellectual elaboration about something that could come to exist, which is a global environmental justice movement. And there are many reasons why this. I don't think that uncovering this or making it visible is something that university researchers should do. We should explain what is happening in the world, isn't it? And we can add some theory, so much the better, but at least explain what is going on. For instance, you mentioned Berta Cáceres, which for some reason has become well known because of the atrocity that was committed and because they wanted to kill her. And they also wanted to kill Gustavo Castro, who was with her, and he escaped so he could say what had happened, because they were planning in Honduras to say it was an internal fight in her own organization. And this failed. This crime they were going to do, they already had an explanation for the crime before the crime, and the explanation failed. The crime took place. But there are many Berta Cáceres, as you say, and many men also. So we have an article about to be published, and we collected, which is a kind of sad thing to do, especially for an economist. Well, I got a prize for economics, but sometimes now I am an official economist again, because I usually describe myself as un economista arrepentido, so somebody who is no longer an economist. But I mean, I am an economist, but I think that these things should be visible and they take place, and therefore we have this article with about 10 or 15 women killed around the world, in the south of the world, but not only in the last 2 or 3 years as activists. So this is the reality. Should we hide this reality? No, we should explain this reality and explain the political ecology of these things that happen. And I take myself an optimistic side to all this, because perhaps of old age also. One has to be optimistic the older we become, I think, to leave a good memory. And the optimist side is a reasonable attempt, because all this perhaps is one of the forces that can change the economy of the world. If this movement were stronger, then it would be easier to change the economy, together with public policies and carbon dividends and many other attempts or technological changes like photovoltaic energy. So that's how what I believe about the others.
Thank you. Let's see. Yes.
As President Monaco alluded to, this is a very ironic day for you to be receiving the prize, in that President Trump is, as we speak, striking down what President Obama put in place to protect the environment and with regard to climate change at the EPA. So I'm interested in your views as to what you think the genuine constraints or obstacles or threats such moves are going to impose, and what can be done aside from just hunkering down and waiting for 4 years to pass.
Yes, killing people is one thing, killing ideas and policies is another strategy. And so who would like to respond to that? As to Jim?
Well, I suppose as an American, I should step up to this. Look, far be it from me to minimize the damage that the Trump-Pence regime is capable of inflicting on the environment and on the world over the next few years. That said, I think we should avoid falling into a state of total despair and this is the end game and we've lost and all is lost. No, that's not the case. In terms of climate policy specifically, there is a lot of scope for action within the US at the level of the states in particular, including big important states. California already has a climate policy which is out front of that Obama was able to try to institute during his term in office. The Clean Power Plan, which is what Trump is in the process of scrapping, had goals for emissions reductions from power plants that Massachusetts was already on track to exceed. There are ongoing initiatives. There are 3 bills now before the Massachusetts state legislature that involve a carbon permit and dividend system, a tax and dividend system. There's a lot that can be done and is being done. And those actions will mean that the damage that is done in Washington will be somewhat limited. Moreover, we're just one country. I mean, we may be a particularly big and powerful one, but the rest of the world is moving forward to address climate change. A sad thing from the US standpoint is this is yet another way in which our past leadership in the world is now slipping away from us, for better or worse. I mean, in certain ways, I feel glad that our children won't have to bear the burden of being the world hegemon, but still, we're losing it fast here. But other countries are moving ahead, including China, and moving ahead in ways to address climate change, in part because of the tremendous public health co-benefits of reducing their use of fossil fuels that in China are just enormous benefits that I think are really helping to drive the policy there. One last thing is climate change is not a question of falling off a cliff. I mean, sometimes the environmental advocates have used these notions of deadlines, and this is the constraint, and if we go beyond this point, we're past the point of no return, and so on. But in reality, we're talking here about rising costs per ton of carbon. We're on an exponential curve. The more damage we do, that doesn't mean there's no longer any point in trying to do anything about it. It means it's even more important to do something about it. So my hope is that there will be a change in the political climate in this country and in Washington, and that in the new dispensation that emerges from that, we'll be able to really make progress in addressing these issues. This is, what do they call it? A learnable moment, a teaching moment, something like that? Yeah.
Teachable moment. It's a teachable moment. Yes, it is, indeed.
I want to add something about the debate on unburnable fuels, which I was talking yesterday to John Burns here, who knows a lot about energy, and he said, well, this in the States is not very much debated, isn't it? And Nicholas Stern, who got one of these prizes also some years ago, like Bina Agarwal also, so we are quoting among themselves, which is a sign of a school, isn't it? But I mean, Nicholas Stern, he has an institute in London, and a bit late, because this was already discovered, the fact that if we burn all the fossil fuels on the ground, mainly coal at the present speed, then we're going to go to 400 parts per million, 500 parts per million in 100 years. And therefore, because we're raising the carbon dioxide about 1 part per million per year now, it's not yet starting to decline. And peak emissions have not been reached yet. So we are really in doing badly. And well, this issue of unburnable fuels, which is not very much discussed here, but is more discussed in Europe, I think, justifies, for instance, in Europe and in Germany now, a movement called Ende Gelände, which means we are up to here, Ende Gelände, which are invading symbolically from time to time lignite mines near Cologne and near Berlin. They have done this 2 or 3 times. And they know exactly what they are doing. I mean, it's like the anti-nuclear movement in the 70s, which managed to stop some power stations, nuclear power stations, isn't it? In this country also, I remember, well, some examples. And therefore, there is a connection between the global issues of how to stop more emissions and the local reasoning that keeping brown coal, lignite, on the soil is very good for the local environment. So this connection between global movements to keep coal in the soil and so on, which Naomi Klein, in a book which is quite interesting to read, calls Blockadia actions. And she claims that Blockadia is the name which is being used in North America, Canada, and here for stopping pipelines. And I don't know how many of you went to Washington when the Keystone, what's the name? Keystone pipeline was being stopped for the first time. Now it's going to revive again, and then perhaps will be stopped later. Anyway, that this means that there is this possible connection between local actions for local reasons sometimes, but connected to global changes. And this, I think, is something that perhaps is increasing, isn't it? That's what I mentioned before that one can do public policies, but also support this kind of local actions. It sounds a bit strange that people don't want to profit from because then these become stranded assets, as they are called, isn't it? So a lot of money. I don't know whether Tufts University you have disinvested, isn't it? I didn't think of this before, but just came now. Well, it doesn't make any difference, to tell the truth, whether I don't know how much you can invest. My own university lives from month to month, so we cannot disinvest very much. But disinvesting is one strategy. It's a very pedagogical thing for students if their own university disinvest from fossil fuels, but doesn't make any difference in real terms, I think. Well, in real terms, in immediate terms. But the fact that this movement exists is exactly shows the awareness between local and global issues.
One last question? All right, let's see. Yes.
So I was struck that both speakers talked a lot about environmental justice in local communities, protecting biodiversity, and the local people are stewards of the environment. It seems to me there are many compelling examples of this, but we have a set of examples that we don't talk about nearly as much in the US, where local people in the West are very happy to appropriate natural resources and use them for their own benefit. So this is a question of what's the difference? Do we like local people being in control when they're on our team? Or is it imaginable that much poorer people might have equally short-sighted approaches to appropriating public resources, separating it out from the income level of the people in the West?
Well, I think the theory of the environmentalists of the poor and the indigenous does not say that everybody who is poor is going to take care of the environment, because you can observe many cases in which poor people are not taking care of them. The theory says that when there is an environmental conflict, and there are all the time environmental conflicts because of the march of the economy towards the commodity extraction frontiers and because of waste disposal, and this is why the environmental justice movement in the States arose, at least the terms environmental justice, popular epidemiology, environmental racism, all this was the cultural product of this movement here. It means that when there is this kind of conflicts, poor people are more likely to be on the side of the environment than the companies trying to make money from the environment. But does not mean that everybody who is poor is an environmentalist at heart or in practice. So you have to go through the conflicts to understand why one can say that poor people are inclined to defend the environment in relative terms, and not always, but quite often.
Let me just add that, Frank, you referred to the appropriation of resources out west, but of course it's also an expropriation of resources, particularly from the Native American populations that were there before. These aren't necessarily the poorest people who are leading the charge. But I think the broader point is that I don't think either, much as Joan and I both have a lot of sympathies for people who we've known in low-income communities around the world, we're not ascribing any particular virtue, I think, that comes with poverty. What we're really pointing to instead, I think, is how the inequality between some and others is implicated in the dynamics of environmental destruction, and who benefits and who bears the cost. It's the fact that it's low-income communities here and around the world who bear so much of the cost, I think, that above all explains why they fight to protect the environment. They're fighting to protect their lives, their health, their assets. And so it's the real issue is how to create a social and political and economic order in which it's no longer so easy for a few people to abuse the environment for their own benefit at the expense of many others. And that's really a question that isn't so much about what is an individual community doing with its resources right now. It's about how can we restructure the power relations, I would say, and both economic and political power that allow us to have as a people greater democratic control over our environment.
I think it's been a wonderful event in terms of demonstrating the congruity among economics, equity, and environment. And in fact, I'm struck by how many inequities fossil fuels cause. And the economic and social injustices that occur between those who extract and those who suffer the consequences. And one other area I'd like to add, which you didn't mention, is the number of conflicts in the world over fossil fuels. If you think about it, it's obviously all over the Middle East, China and all its neighbors, right? There's almost no place in the world that you can't point to a fossil fuel connected conflict, source of conflict. And that's a conflict among the elites, but the consequences fall on the poor. So a different aspect of environmental and economic justice. I just thought I'd toss into your hopper for you to consider, since you guys think of it so clearly and so effectively. Okay, thank you both very much, and congratulations.